In 2011, a team working in a farmer's field in the eastern Nile Delta cut down through a layer of dark, wet soil and found a human hand. A few centimeters away, another. By the end of that season, they had 12. Every one of them was a right hand. Everyone had been taken off cleanly at the wrist, with no arm bone left attached, and all of them had been buried in shallow pits in the courtyard of a palace, a few steps from the door of the throne room. It's the only find of its kind ever recorded in ancient Egypt. The bones can tell us how carefully those hands were cut, roughly how old their owners were, and how long they'd been dead when they went into the ground. On one question, they stopped just short. The site is called Tel El Daba. 3,500 years ago, it was called Avaris, and it was the capital city of the Hyksos, rulers who came into Egypt from the Levant and held the north of the country as the 15th dynasty, somewhere between 1640 and 1530 BC. The palace that the Austrian team was excavating there had been a serious building. Seal impressions from one of its earlier phases carry the name of the Hyksos ruler Kian. Everything about that region works against archaeology. The ground is wet. The soil is dark and chemically aggressive, and it stains bone until bone and dirt are the same color. What comes out of it is soft, brittle, and easy to destroy on the way out. Small bones are the ones that lose. A skull announces itself. A hand does not. Hand bones are little. They sit right at the top of the sequence in this part of the site, and by the time anyone notices them, half of them can already be gone. Which means the 12 hands that came out of those pits are the ones that survived being found. The team lifted them in blocks, hardened the bone with glue on site, cut the whole pit floor out in a plaster cast, and carried it to a lab because there was no other way to move them without losing them. Then they looked at where the pits were sitting, not out past the walls, not under a floor somewhere private. The forecourt, the open ground in front of the throne room, where anyone standing in that palace could see it happening. Now, let's talk about what was actually down there, because the arrangement matters more than the number. 3 pits. The biggest one, catalogued as L1543, held 8 hands. A second pit 7 meters away held 3. And a third, small one, sat directly in front of the throne room with a single hand in it, sealed underneath the wall of a building that went up later, which is probably a temple. That's 12 hands, so a minimum of 12 people. But scattered between them were loose fingers. Some of those fingers might have drifted off the hands already in the pit. Some might be all that's left of hands nobody recovered. Counted the second way, the number goes as high as 18. All of them belonged to adults. The growth plates in the bones had closed, so nobody was a child. And there was no arthritis, no thinning, none of the wear that piles up in a body that gets old. Whoever they were finished growing and nowhere near finished living. Then there's the detail that turns this from a mass of body parts into a rule. Every hand from all 3 pits was a right hand. Not most, all of them. Somebody was checking. A hand can be removed from an arm in 2 ways, and the 2 ways leave very different evidence. Get this part wrong, and the whole story reads as a battlefield. Get it right, and it reads as something that was planned. Quick one before that. This channel digs through the actual excavation reports for cases like this instead of recycling whatever went viral, and there's a new one every week. Subscribe and you'll get the next one instead of whatever the algorithm feels like handing you. So, 2 ways. The fast way is to cut through the forearm wherever the blade happens to land. It's quick, it works on someone who's still moving, and it leaves a piece of arm bone hanging off the wrist. The careful way goes through the joint itself. You open the capsule, cut the tendons crossing the wrist, and the hand comes free. Done properly, the blade never touches bone at all, so there's nothing to find afterwards. 6 of the hands still had their wrist bones preserved well enough to check. The team went over every surface with a magnifying glass, looking specifically for cut marks. There weren't any, and not one hand in any of the 3 pits had a scrap of forearm attached to it. So either the cutting was done by somebody who knew the anatomy, or somebody cleaned the hands up afterwards and took the extra bone off. Either way, the message is the same. These weren't dumped. They were prepared. Somebody wanted each one to arrive looking exactly like a hand. 8 of the 11 complete hands were lying palm down. 6 of them had their fingers spread wide apart, and several had the knuckle joints bent backwards, further than a hand normally goes. That posture is the closest thing this case has to a clock, And it's the reason the worst question in the whole find is still open. A hand can only be pushed into that shape while it's soft. Once rigor mortis sets in, the tissue locks and stops cooperating. In a hand, rigor usually starts around 6 to 8 hours after death and then releases again roughly a day or two later. So there are two windows, and only two. Window 1 is before rigor. That would mean the hands were taken from bodies that had just died, or from people who were still alive during the ceremony or in the hours just before it. Window 2 is after rigor has passed. That would mean the hands were collected somewhere else, kept for a day or more, and carried to the palace afterwards. The researchers thought the second window was more likely. Collected, held, transported, presented. There's a supporting detail too. Not one bone showed animal gnawing, which suggests the pits weren't left open long enough for anything to get at them. But likely isn't the same as known. The bones record how flexible a hand was when it went into the ground. They don't record whether its owner could still feel it being taken. That question is not answered, and with this evidence, it can't be. None of that explains why a palace would want them. For that, we have to leave the pits and go to a tomb wall about 100 kilometers upriver, because there's a man who wrote the answer down himself. His name was Amos, son of Ibana, and he was a naval officer from the town of El Kab. He fought in the war that finally drove the Hyksos out of Egypt, and part of that war was the siege of Avaris, the same city. He carved his career into the wall of his own tomb, and one part of it is a plain accounting entry. He describes fighting on the water at Avaris, taking an enemy, and carrying off a hand. He describes the hand being reported to the royal herald, and he describes being given the gold of valor for it. Then the fighting starts again in the same place. He takes another hand, and he's given the gold a second time. The gold of valor was a real reward, typically a collar of golden beads, given by the king, in public. Egyptian temple walls from the New Kingdom show the same system running at scale. Piles of severed hands laid out on the ground in front of the throne, and scribes counting them. So, a hand was a receipt. It was proof that a soldier had killed somebody, and it converted into jewelry, land, and status in front of an audience. That's what makes the location of those pits so uncomfortable. They're sitting in the open courtyard, facing the door where the ruler appeared. The bones aren't the ceremony. They're what was swept up afterwards. That's the leading explanation. It isn't the only one, and the disagreement is worth knowing about because it changes who these 12 people were. The Egyptologist Danielle Candelora has argued for a different reading. Her point is that the Hyksos came out of a West Asian world with its own legal tradition, one where cutting off a hand was a recognized punishment written into law codes for offenses running from insubordination up to rebellion. She also notes that the hands don't appear to have all gone into the ground at the same moment, and that the Avaris deposit doesn't match the later Egyptian records of hand counting in several ways. Set against that, hand removal isn't recorded anywhere in Egyptian law as a punishment. The Gresky team leaned on that, plus the care of the cutting and the public placement, to argue against the punishment reading. The two versions produce completely different dead people. One gives you enemy soldiers killed in a fight on the losing side. The other gives you somebody's own men or their own subjects punished at the palace gate as a warning. The hands look the same either way, and then there's the detail that traveled furthest. Almost every article written about this find mentioned that one of the 12 hands may have belonged to a woman. It's the line people remember. It's also the softest claim in the entire study. The bones were too degraded for DNA, so sex had to be estimated from the ratio between the second and fourth finger. 11 hands read male, 1 read female. That one hand also happened to be the one where the second and fourth fingers were incomplete, so the measurements had to be estimated rather than taken. The researchers wrote it down carefully, said a woman couldn't be ruled out, and left it there. She may have been a fighter. She may be a measurement error. 3,500 years later, that's the entire file on her. 12 adults. No names, no origins, no cause of death, and no bodies. Egyptians of that era believed a person needed to be physically complete to survive death at all. Whoever ordered this understood that. Taking the hand wasn't the end of what it did to them. 12 right hands buried in the open at the door of a throne room by people who cared enough to take the arm bones off first. Everything after that is argument.